The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Does the Greater Golden Horseshoe need a new east-west highway? The Ontario government says yes. Tonight, we'll explore their rationale and find out why critics stand firm against the 413 highway. Then, our Ontario Hub's report on new research on how to make remote work better. And from proposed changes to provincial labor law to Canadian veterans working to save Afghan translators, we've got the agendas we can review. It's Friday, November 12th, and that's ahead on the agenda. Highway 413 would span across the Halton, Peel, and York regions. The Ontario government says it is critical to reducing congestion. Others disagree and say the 400 series road will create more problems than it solves. With us for more, all in Ontario's capital city, Teresa De Felice, Assistant Vice President of Government and Community at CAA South Central Ontario. Maddie Simiatiki, Professor of Geography and Planning at the University of Toronto and Director of the U of T's Infrastructure Institute. And Emma McIntosh, Environment and Investigative Reporter at the Narwhal. I welcome to you all.
Thank you.
Hello.
So it seems like this conversation is a hot button issue. Before we get into it, I just wanted to bring up a map to go over the where this highway will be. As this map shows, Highway 413, also known as the GTA West Corridor, is proposed to be 59-kilometer, 4 to 6 lane highway running from Highway 400 in Vaughan and curving west to where Highways 401 and 407 meet near Mississauga, Milton, and Halton Hills. It would cut through the regions of York, Peel, and Halton. Teresa, I wanted to start with you. Can you describe the government's rationale for this highway at this time?
So it appears that, there's lots of conversation about reducing congestion, improving commute times. And so I think these are the two factors that the government is trying to focus on. These are always hot button topics. They've been around for a very long time. I participated in many forums. But, as we sort of come back out of the pandemic, 19 months that we've had, 20 months that we've had, even at this point where people aren't fully back to work, we're seeing traffic volumes pretty high. I venture a guess, almost 2/3 of what they were in some parts of the GTA. And so, looking towards the future, if you don't start sort of planning for what's coming, which is a whole lot more population growth in this region, how are we going to deal with some of the challenges that are going to come at that time when we already, have a bit of a problem and have had a problem around congestion for a number of years.
Maddie, I want to come to you next because, as Teresa mentioned, we've been in a pandemic. It seems like we're in month, 75. And I think a lot of us have been focusing on COVID, vaccine mandate. Parents with autistic children have been asking the government for support. And the government is saying that, this highway will reduce congestion. And we've been hearing that a lot. How does this plan measure up in those terms?
Well, as we come out of the pandemic, people are certainly looking for a new beginning and new alternatives, new ways of doing things. This highway will take us in exactly the wrong direction. This highway will lock in gridlock for generations to come. It will damage the environment at a time when we're grappling with climate change, and it will be terrible for the budget. It is a huge financial hit. Budgeted at $6 billion, but with no numbers currently released. This project is only to go up in costs. The government has also announced that we'll have no tolls on it. So that means that the taxpayers are going to be paying for everyone to use this highway. It will be congested soon after it is built. It will not solve the problems that people are looking to address around congestion, and it will create all sorts of other issues around the environment, social inclusion, pollution, loss of green space, the green belt, farmland. This project really is not what we need coming out of the pandemic, and it'll be bad for the region.
And I'm thinking that if someone from the government was here, they might say that, yes, all those things might be things to consider, but we're coming out of a pandemic, and this obviously will create a lot of new jobs, and it will help the economy of Ontario. What do you say to that?
Construction projects definitely do create jobs, but construction projects in all sectors create jobs. We should be using construction to build the type of infrastructure that will propel us forward coming out of the pandemic. The schools, the long-term care, the affordable housing, transit, dense communities, all of the infrastructure that will put us on a different path and set this region forward to really grow and prosper coming out of the pandemic. We need jobs, and the construction sector is important. When we give people opportunities and when we are employing labor, let's have that labor working towards a different future than the one that's going to lock in pollution and social exclusion.
And Emma, Maddie mentioned that this new highway will actually create more congestion. Can you talk to us about the idea of induced demand?
Yeah, so the idea of induced demand is actually decades old, and it's kind of one of the fundamentals of highway planning science. People tend to think that if you build a new road, that opens up flow and that more cars will have room to move, but that's not actually the way it works in real life. New roads tend to attract new drivers or more drivers. There tends to be a short-term benefit, and within a couple of years, the new expanded road is just as crowded as the old one.
Well, Teresa, I think as we've mentioned, the idea around this highway is to stop this congestion because people need to get home to their families. This highway is a resurrection of an old proposal. What's different this time around?
I mean, there's a renewed sense of trying to move forward with a project. I think there has been some redrawing of lines, and I think that still needs to be determined. What's the best path or route if the government does, in fact, decide to proceed with the project once all the, sort of reviews happen, and then it determines that this is a project that it's going to stick with. I think that people are frustrated and have been for a long time, and I think they're, even when I sat on the previous premier's transit advisory investment strategy at the time when we were looking at all the different projects and how to fund transit and build the transit infrastructure in the GTA, even with all of the different relief efforts, it wasn't so much that we were going to reduce congestion as was the big realization. It was to keep it at not getting worse. And as Emily said, the induced demand, yes, if you build the lanes, there's going to be cars on them. And I think that, there's a lot of other solutions that need to be part of the solution or be part of addressing the challenges. So great to continue to build transit and invest in transit. There's different fixes that can be done for some problems. Are there tweaks that we can make, ramp metering, different ways of how we have flow on the traffic to create an ease. But we have to think about what are the best ways. We cannot build enough roads to deal with all of the cars on them. At some point, there is a supply and demand balance that has to be had. And it's like when you outstrip the current demand, supply, is this the solution to dealing with demand? And these become very political driven conversations. They get changed, they get canceled depending on who's in, who's out. But the conversation is there and we're having it. So we have to sort of see what's to come over the next little while as they continue to review this.
You brought up transit.
That they want to redo this.
You brought up transit, and we're going to talk more about that in a moment. But I wanted to show you a clip, and this is from Premier Doug Ford. He was in Caledon on Wednesday selling the highway to potential voters in the upcoming election. Let's take a look at what he said. Sheldon, please roll.
We live in a democracy. The majority of the people want this highway. We're building the highway. And you can't be, you're talking about ideology. You can't sit there like the previous government did for 15 years. The NDP and the Liberals stood by while people were stuck in traffic. We want to make sure that we take care of the people and get them home a lot quicker, to get goods to the market a lot quicker, and just sitting there and telling people, hop on your bicycle or get behind a horse and buggy and start driving, it doesn't cut it. That's the ideology of a lot of people that are from downtown Toronto making their comments about up here in Caledon.
The premier there said that we live in a democracy and that the majority of people want this, but then he went to say that it seems as if this might be a Toronto versus everybody situation. Emma, I wanted to get your read on it. Is opposition to this plan really only a Toronto thing?
Yeah, I think that's a bit of a mischaracterization from the premier there. If you look at the municipalities along the route of the 413, most of them have pulled their support, and that's in response to strong opposition from citizens who asked their elected officials to take a stand. If
And
we're
why are they
talking about
opposed to it? Why are they opposed
I think
to
a lot of people seem to be really opposed to the environmental impact. COP is going on right now. There's a lot of discussion about reducing carbon emissions. And a lot of people can't really see how A, building a road through the Greenbelt is a good idea, but B, how it makes sense to lock in decades of having more cars that are going to reduce more carbon or emit more carbon and therefore maybe mess with our climate goals.
So why that framing then from the premier?
I think it's an easy ideological wedge, and that's something that the Fords in particular found a lot of success with actually in Toronto City Council, and I think they're making a bet that they can make the same move and it'll play just as well.
And Maddie, we've heard so many different so many reasons behind this. One of them is that people are stuck in traffic. People who take transit also, if you live in different parts of Toronto, it could take you anywhere from 60 minutes to an hour and a half to get home using transit. But the argument that the government is saying is that they want to give people an extra 30 minutes to get home to their family. Why that message?
It's very powerful to provide, to speak to people about getting home quicker. People are stuck in traffic. It is extremely frustrating to be stuck in traffic. And for many parts of the region, the car right now is really the only option. We have built a region that has a dense urban core, but has much of the region is car dependent and car oriented. It was planned that way and it was built that way. And so now people are stuck in traffic and looking for options. And so it's a very powerful message to say we will build the highways that will deliver you from this terrible gridlock. The problem is that it doesn't work, and the phenomena of induced demand is real. The opposition to this project isn't about ideology. It's about science. It's the science of studying traffic over many years and decades and understanding that this project will not solve the problem. It sounds good in a soundbite, but it doesn't actually address the real underlying problems. And what we need to do is think much more strategically about how this region grows and to invest heavily in public transit, which we've missed for generations, to provide people with true options to get around.
We're going to talk about solutions in a few moments. Yes, yes, go ahead, Emma.
Just to challenge one thing from there, the government's estimate is 30 minutes of time savings. That's highly disputed. A previous study done by the Liberal government in 2017 concluded that the actual time savings were about 30 to 60 seconds on average. So that's a contentious point.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up because, Teresa, I think if anyone heard you get an extra 30 minutes out of your day, everybody would be like, yes, please, right? But a previous report, as Emma mentioned, said that it would actually be just 30 seconds. How are these numbers then? How do we come up with these numbers?
So, there's various ways to do that. A lot of instances, you can do modeling that can tell you, if you do this and along this route and you put these sort of inputs into it, you can put the existing levels of traffic, the existing density, you can put planned density, and it gives you sort of a predictive model about what the flow could look like, with some degree of certainty and some degree of uncertainty, to be quite honest. And we've seen projects like this in the past. Demand modeling was used for the St. Clair right-of-way. It was used to look at the Gardiner Expressway a few times. It can be challenging. U of T does a lot of, we've worked with projects with U of T and looking at their demand modeling. It's as good as the inputs you put into it with the information you know and can best guess at the time. And so, even from when those studies are done, maybe it was a minute. I don't know what it would be now. It might be 2 minutes. It could be 30 minutes. We're not sure. I think there are studies that can help give you some idea. The government does need to be clear. If they're looking to shave, 30 minutes off of people's commute, that's a very aggressive target, considering the levels of congestion we had before the pandemic, what is possibly expected as we come out of the pandemic, with people still not jumping back onto transit. Transit needs to be continued to be built, as Maddie said. There needs to be expanded, and the reliability of transit needs to be a factor. But we also, know that, just keeping it at the level it is and trying to save 30 minutes are very different objectives. And
do you think, though,
that
it's
needs to be
misleading?
factored in.
Do you think, though, because we've been hearing, it seems to be a lot of certainty about the 30 minutes, but do you think that it's misleading to then use that as a selling point for this highway?
I think that's the hope, and then that may be an objective. I think that the government's committed money to this and a couple of other two major road projects. They've also committed money to transit. We haven't heard the exact numbers as of yet, and the transit projects are currently being built. So, I also think most Ontarians believe that just building roads aren't the solution. So there's a lot of support for continued expansion of the transit infrastructure. And they're just hopeful that it doesn't get any worse than what it is now. And so I think that, some degree of where that target lands of what they're trying to achieve will come out of the studies and the conversations and the evaluations that need to come.
Maddie, one of the other reasons that the government is saying that this highway is needed is because they need to prepare for the future and the population is going to grow. Should highways be privileged over transit in those conversations?
No, and one of the things that we know from traffic modeling over the years for big highway projects is that they tend to overestimate the benefits and underestimate the costs. This is research from Professor Ben Fluberg from Oxford University. So this notion that we're going to save 30 minutes on a trip on this highway seems highly unlikely. And the costs of this project have also not been released yet. So we know really we don't have information about how much this is really going to cost. And that's the type of information both on the demand side, but also on the cost side that would be needed. In terms of highways, we've built a region that is really oriented towards the car and oriented towards highways. And people are stuck in traffic now. And the notion that building more highways is going to get us out of this congestion mess is just not realistic. What we need to be doing is planning in a very different way, looking at intensifying, looking at connecting our communities with public transit, bringing all of people's daily needs closer to where they live so that they don't have to travel as far. Coming out of the pandemic, I think people are really looking to live differently, to do things differently. There's an opportunity for change. And going back to just building bigger highways, I think takes us in the wrong direction.
And Emma, when Maddie talks about living differently, I think the absolute utopia for everybody would be to be able to walk to work or maybe cycle to work, and that's not the reality. Do you think that highway infrastructure create a different type of community than building transit does?
Yeah, I think a long history of urban planning shows us that it does. It doesn't mean it has to be that way forever. We're at this historic moment where governments at all levels are investing a ton of money in infrastructure. And as Maddie pointed out earlier, all kinds of infrastructure can create jobs. And we see that the Ford government has put a focus on transit-oriented communities as one of the ways it wants to move forward. And it'll be really interesting to watch how that's executed, because I think that, yeah, you're right. A lot of people do see that as the future. It doesn't solve everything.
Teresa, not everybody can afford a car. Lots of hidden costs with owning a car. And if newcomers are expected to live in these regions, it can take a long time for people to become established, build credit, be able to afford a vehicle. Is there a different way to approach getting people from A to B that's more inclusive?
And I think human behavior on all fronts, on the person who's, coming and deciding where to live in a city, to the heads of organizations that are moving industry, manufacturing, volume level jobs out of the city is also a factor. There's economics, there's, just decisions to be made. And so we've got a lot of factors that are impacting. So what we would like the ideal state to be is that there's enough jobs in each community that the people who live there can access those jobs. Even through the pandemic, there was, story after story about people deciding to trade in their condo or their home in the city and move outwards because now they're working remotely, and it's still early to determine whether we'll be working remotely still in the long term. I think, we're looking at new models, and we like kind of the being at home to some extent. Some people hate it. We have the hybrid model coming into play. There's a lot of things you don't know. And it's a tough part for politicians. At some point, they put a stake in the sand to say, this is what we're going to do, and this is why. Yes, I'm sure the government has looked at its polling numbers to see what meets its supporters, to determine that this is something that is important to them. There's a whole lot of factors that aren't easily played out. And so this live work thing is not even currently working in the city of Toronto. Reverse commuters, more, a lot of the lands that were for bigger volume jobs aren't here anymore.
And Emma, you mentioned earlier that this announcement came during the COP26 climate conference happening in Glasgow. And when we talk about the future, if we build a highway, the future for the environment might actually be, we might not realize the extent of what's coming next. The proposed Highway 413 is expected to run between farmlands and the Greenbelt situated between Caledon and Brampton. Emma, what are the most pressing environmental concerns about both Highway 413 and the Bradford Bypass proposal?
I think the biggest thing with both the bypass and with Highway 413 is that they would run through the Greenbelt. People in Ontario, especially the greater Golden Horseshoe area, get very hyped up about the Greenbelt for good reason. It's this big ring of protected land, precious farmland, very sensitive ecosystem and forest. And if we harm that, that's damage that can't easily be undone. The issue of climate and carbon emissions from the new road is a major one that will have long-term consequences. And in terms of other impacts, this is going to eat up farmland. In the case of both highways, farmland that we need to have a local food supply. It's going to eat up sensitive wetlands. These are things that are very, very long-term consequences. Road salt pollution in waterways is another one that will impact endangered species. And maybe that's worth it for Ontarians, and maybe that's worth it for the government, but I think it's worth considering.
And Maddie, we mentioned the timing of this, that this happened during COP26. What do you make of the timing of this announcement?
Well, the timing is just the complete opposite of what is being talked about at COP26, that we need to get our emissions under control, and that transportation is one of the major sectors. So in addition to electrifying our transportation network, we also need to be providing real alternatives to people. One of the most damaging aspects of this highway is the type of land use patterns that it will encourage. It will encourage the continuation of single-family, auto-oriented developments, not the types of intensification, the types of mixed uses that are needed. Surely we do have highways and we need them to move goods around and for people to move, but we need real alternatives, and building more highways doesn't solve that. It actually exacerbates the problem through the phenomenon of induced demand.
And Emma, a lot of people are saying that we do have a solution right now, and the solution is Highway 407. How could that be a solution, and why aren't we not focusing on that?
Well, as to the why we aren't focusing on it, I'm not sure. But in terms of how it could be a solution, certainly for the 413, it runs almost exactly parallel to the proposed route of the new highway. And in 2017, the Liberal government found that if they were to just subsidize tolls for trucks on the 407, that it would deliver very comparable benefits to the 413. When it comes to the Bradford Bypass, the government commissioned a report in 2014 that looked at dozens of solutions that could also help the situation further north between the 400 and the 404, where the Bradford Bypass is. Improving interchanges is one of those things. Widening the 400 is another thing, or existing east-west roads. A lot of those things have their own environmental impact and might not be ideal, but the footprint is smaller. And similar to the way that we think about like COVID restrictions, for example, we can do multi-layered things. And if we layer solutions, they together can make something comprehensive that can guide us to a better place. I think that's the way to think about this now.
Teresa?
Yeah, I mean, I think Emma makes a good point in that there are lots of solutions that all need to be worked together. Even some of the, in speaking to our CA members, right? They know that there's not one solution that's going to fix all of this problem. We've put out reports in 2012 and 2017, and again in 2018, that says that that you need to look at a variety of things, and including optimizing the existing network, making transit a viable solution. And that's not just building, which definitely needs to be done, but getting the operation up and running so that people have a level of consistency, that on one day it's taking them 30 minutes to get from one end to the other of where they're going. Another day it could take them an hour and 15. This lack of predictability also dissuades people from actually using transit as an alternative. Because I think that, part of it is you have to have the infrastructure. You have to make sure that we're using the infrastructure at the best possible, in the best possible way. And then you have to support the behaviors to maximize all those things out there, that now that you've given people the options and the predictability that need just for their own lifestyle and how they make choices.
We only have about 30 seconds left, and I wanted to get Maddie in on this. Maddie, you've the last 30 seconds.
Sure. The one idea that we haven't discussed is also about road tolls. And road tolls can play a very powerful role in managing demand for highways, achieving that smooth flow, and then funding the alternatives of public transit and the construction of complete communities. That was also in some of the earlier reporting on how what the alternatives are to Highway 413.
Teresa, Maddie, and Emma, thank you so much. As I mentioned before we started taping, a bunch of us were talking about this, and this is definitely a hot button issue. And I'm sure we'll be talking about this in the months to come. Thank you so much for your insights. It's appreciated.
For many people, working from home became standard practice almost overnight during this pandemic. Now, new research out of the Niagara region offers some insight into what can help make remote and hybrid working models successful, even as companies look towards post-pandemic arrangements. Justin Chandler covers the Hamilton-Niagara region for Ontario Hubs, and he joins us now on that. Welcome, Justin.
Hi, thank you.
All right, so let's talk about the study that you reported on. What was it exactly looking at when we talk about remote work?
The Niagara Community Observatory put together a piece, and it's a policy brief. So it looks at all sorts of different research about remote work. And the goal is to put together a series of questions that employers can ask themselves now that they have the option of not doing remote work because it's an emergency and it's the only way to work, but because now just a lot of people like doing it. So as workplaces try and figure out what they want to do, the goal of this brief was to give them questions they can ask to decide, like, okay, are we the right fit for this, and can we support it long term?
Now let's talk about sort of barriers that come with working from home. We know that this particular study, and we know in Niagara that roughly 70,000 people were working from home during this pandemic. What were some of the obstacles and barriers there?
Well, some of them are ones that we'll have heard about before. Internet was a big one that I heard about, especially in the more rural areas. People working from home with young children doing schooling, or just young children being around was difficult, having resources. But then there's also things like just not feeling connected to coworkers was actually something really big, or troubles with communication and trying to connect to people in a way that you might normally be able to in an office just didn't really work the same virtually.
Now we should say, while there are some challenges, there have been some successes as well. What did you learn about that?
Well, people love getting the time back spent commuting. A lot of people would spend 2 hours a day commuting, and suddenly that time's back and there's more that they can do. People have said that they like a little bit of a more casual environment. Maybe they don't have to dress up so much. So there's just some benefits like that.
Now, I'm sure our managers will enjoy this question, because I think a lot of focus has been sort of on, how do we as, workers sort of deal with the day-to-day stuff, but managers also have to deal with other stuff, whether it's complaints and concerns amongst employees, but also that sort of culture building as well. What are the challenges for managers, and how are they different?
Well, I'm hearing from researchers and from people involved, even in business, that yes, the managers actually need to do a lot more work here. And it requires a lot of introspection when trying to figure out if they can support a remote team. Now, a lot of managers didn't get any training on how to do this, but now that things are moving forward, places like the South Niagara Chambers of Commerce are actually offering training so that managers can better figure out how to do work remotely. It requires changes in how you supervise a team, but also in how you create opportunities for those sorts of more social connections, like whether you're going to do informal socials or whether you're going to pair up interns with mentors. I think a lot more intention is required, and that's one of the biggest things that I've been hearing is that you can't just expect your team to work the same as they would when they could all see each other. There's actually a lot more mediation and a lot more hands-on work that is needed to create those opportunities.
What I found quite interesting is you looked at something regarding personality. Is there a specific kind of personality that is best suited for remote work? And I was surprised there might be some conversation about age, but not the way that most people might think as well when it comes to remote work.
Right. So as far as when you talk about that, like a lot of people might think, okay, young people are going to be great at this because they do video calls all the time. They know how to do texting. They've got up-to-date devices. But actually what a lot of young people were reporting in the research that I've looked at is that they were struggling because people who are more established in their careers and who already knew each other really well were finding it easier to communicate with one another online. They sort of knew the nuances. They knew one another's lives. They had networks. And younger people, a lot of them report wanting social connections and wanting to be able to use work as a place where you can also make friends. And even just finding that they didn't know people very well. So it was harder for them to reach out to a coworker with a problem or to reach out to a manager if they didn't feel comfortable with something.
Now, you started working at TVO during a pandemic, but also your job by definition is remote, where maybe a lot of our viewers don't know, but you are situated in the Hamilton area and you cover a region, but you don't come into the office. Actually, we've chatted more on this sort of a remote sort of chat than in person. I've only met you once, in the flesh. But what's that experience been like for you, sort of to come on to a new job, sort of go through, sort of the day-to-day dealing with different programs and also, coming on broadcast as well?
Well, it's really strange. Like you said, we've only met once in person, and I can say JN is even more handsome in person than he is virtually here. But it's just so weird sometimes to work with people and not really know what they look like, other than like this close shoulder shot, not know what it sounds like when they really laugh, or not know a lot about their lives. And so one thing that I try to do is, reach out to people, find what they're interested in, try to share a little bit about their lives. Like I send pictures of things that I see on my morning walks to the group. But you really have to come up with new ways to connect to people, because you're not just talking to them at lunch, or you're not kind of bumping into them in the hallway and saying hi. So you sort of run the risk of a situation where you log on in the morning and then everybody's active light just sort of fades away and they disappear. And so you can feel more isolated, I think, than you do in in a physical office environment.
Justin, really great stuff. Really appreciate it. I don't know if I can make any promises, but hopefully you can hop on a GO train and join me in studio maybe in a few months or so. So we look forward to that, hopefully. Thank you so much.
My fingers are crossed.
The agenda this week checked in on the global climate conversation amid the COP26 conference, as well as heard from futurist Parag Khanna on how that will shape human migration. Learned about the efforts of a group of Canadian veterans to rescue Afghan translators, and assessed Ontario's proposed labour law changes. The agenda's Week in Review begins with an eye to the newly sworn-in federal cabinet.
Justin Trudeau pledged 6 years ago that he was going to be the prime minister who stopped, I guess, what his father started, and that was the increasing centralization of power around the prime minister and his office and his advisors, and he was going to let ministers run their departments more with a freer hand. Paul, how much success has he had at doing that so far?
Before I answer, I just want to point out that I'm being typecast as the nerd here. I was also this panel's only defender of Melanie Joly, who's nobody's nerd. So I've got.
I defended her too. I'm on board with that. I'm on board with that.
Okay. On the centralization of government, Eddie Goldenberg and Ian Brody, who served as chief of staff to previous prime ministers, both wrote compelling books in which they said it's really hard to fight against that centralizing impact. That governing from the center, as Goldenberg said, is the only place you can govern from, and there's a bunch of reasons for that. I would add this often overlooked reason to help explain Trudeau's, own funneling of all important decisions to a small group of advisors around him, which is is that this government has always conceived of itself as essentially a crisis government. The decade before Justin Trudeau became prime minister was the worst decade in the history of the Liberal Party. 3 of its 4 worst election performances ever happened during the decade before Justin Trudeau became prime minister, under Paul Martin, Stéphane Dion, and then Michael Ignatieff. Between 2000 and 2011, the Liberal caucus lost 80% of its MPs, which means that when Trudeau was elected in 2015, 80% of his caucus was rookies, including his justice minister, his health minister, his defense minister, and his finance minister. Not only had they never been cabinet ministers before, they had never sat in Parliament before they stood in Parliament to take questions at question period. That is a fantastic environment in which to centralize power, to elbow aside cabinet ministers for making crucial decisions because you're not sure you can trust them to make crucial decisions, and to have only a small cadre of trusted advisors and their emissaries in ministers' offices, the chiefs of staff, who were all selected by the prime minister's office, making all the real decisions. There's 2 problems. First of all, that small cadre around the prime minister had also never served in those capacities in a federal government. They were as new to those jobs as Bill Morneau and Jane Philpott were. And secondly, the government has never unclenched from that defensive crouch. It has never felt like it has the luxury of letting most ministers be ministers, which means that siege mentality, which quite understandably characterized the first decisions of this government, has never really been cracked.
John Ibbitson, we've got a little over 5 minutes to go, and I want to see if I can get a couple of more items for discussion here. We've had 23 prime ministers since Confederation. Even though Justin Trudeau's only been the PM since 2015, he is already number 10 on the list in terms of time spent in office. Already number 10. In which case, let me ask you, what kind of legacy do you think he is in the process of creating right now?
If he were to step down tomorrow, his legacy would be one of combating more or less successfully, the greatest crisis that we have faced in decades, which was the pandemic, COVID-19. He will always be remembered as someone who brought an effective federal response. Yes, there were issues with vaccine procurement, and yes, there were issues with other supplies. But on the whole, Canada performed reasonably well on that. He's also the prime minister who smashed the consensus that federal governments should not amass huge deficits. Remember, we were in deficit financing long before the pandemic arrived. That will also be part of his legacy. And I think something that doesn't get written about enough, I probably write about it too much, is he will be remembered as the prime minister who finally brought immigration up to the level of 1% of the population. In fact, it is now higher than 1% of the population. It was always high, 250,000 from Brian Mulroney through to Stephen Harper. It's going to be well over 400,000 by the time he leaves office. That is transformative.
Do you believe that the global North has either a moral or ethical obligation to help the global South with this transition?
So I think, if the question is, does the global North have a responsibility to help clean up the mess we've made and to be a force for improving conditions globally and advancing us collectively towards this, low carbon resilient future? Absolutely. Does that give us a free pass to take this kind of paternalistic framing to climate change and prescribe the development priorities of countries that are not our own? Absolutely not. So this is where I get worried when we talk about responsibility of the global north as a way for the global north to actually force the global south to develop along a particular pathway that it itself has not designed.
Harjeet, from what you've seen so far, does the global north, do the countries of the global north look like they are prepared to help, with dollars, make the transition that we're talking about here?
Not at all, Steve, and that's the most frustrating part. We should have seen that money flowing a long time back, and we have reached a stage where we are now already seeing how climate disasters are hitting. It is happening because rich countries did not provide resources. On one hand, they did not reduce their emissions. They did not provide support to developing countries to bend the curve. And even now, as we can see that the money that was committed way back in 2009, is not being provided, and whatever money they claim they have provided is not a real money. It's full of loans and guarantees and not a grant that would have helped developing countries put that architecture in place so that they could leverage and attract trillions that are needed. So we are not looking for billions, we need trillions. And we are not saying that the entire set of trillions have to be grant, but that $100 billion that we talked about is supposed to be the seed money that will help developing countries make that policy shift, which will eventually bring those trillions for the transformation that is needed.
Cheeto, just before I get you to address that, let me in fact put the background again in place, because it was more than a decade ago that at the UN Climate Summit in Copenhagen, that the rich nations made a pledge of $100 billion a year to help the less wealthy nations by the year 2020 to help them adapt to climate change and mitigate further rises in temperature. So, in your view, Cheeto, what's the status of that pledge today?
Well, Harjeet touched on it. I mean, that pledge has not been met year on year, and the money that has come forward has trickled in. It's not enough for what is needed. So it really has been disappointing to say the least regarding progress on those commitments made at Copenhagen. And we're hoping that what comes out of Glasgow will be more actionable and will be targets that countries of the global global north or developed economies, however you want to refer to them, will meet and will stand by. But Harjeet basically said it all. We're very much behind on the agreements made at Copenhagen.
Well, Maisa, I should ask you, do you have any legitimate reason to feel more optimistic coming out of COP26 that the global north will change its attitude on this?
That's a difficult question, because I really don't see the reason why this has not happened. We have seen the trillions that have been invested in the recovery after the pandemic. It would just require a fraction of that to help developing countries to do their part for mitigation. But I think, and this is very important as well, this is not just about mitigation. We have at the same time the opportunity and the need to build resilience. And that part, which it's less quantifiable, it's not tons of carbon, I think has been for too long sort of the small brother or the small sister or the more ignored part of this discussion. And I think that if there's something that the pandemic has shown us, it's that the whole world, and it's not just the developing world, really requires resilience to all these shocks that are occurring now, and they will continue to occur, as we know that when further warming, every bit of warming will continue to increase those impacts.
Can you elaborate on what you like about Canada and why you think it's such a terrific destination?
Sure, and I guess you could consider me an objective voice because I'm not Canadian.
Mm-hmm.
I've only been to Canada certainly less than 10 times in my entire life. So, I take an analytical approach to these issues. Obviously, again, let's think latitude, altitude, and attitude, right? Canada does tick a lot of those boxes, certainly on the latitude and again, the other virtues as well. And, you've just come out of an election where the fact that you are a mass migration country, a country that is taking in 400,000 new migrants every single year, a far higher proportion annually of your own population, about 1%, than any other country in the world is doing. And you're doing so voluntarily as a matter of strategic economic policy and without a major backlash is quite unique. So I consider Canada an absolute role model, not just some kind of fanciful future dream, but a place that's getting it right now. So I hold up Canada in this way, which again, I think is an objective characterization. So for those who are lucky enough to move to Canada, despite what I just said earlier, that could be a one-way ticket. It could be that the hundreds of thousands of people who are moving to Canada every single year may choose never to leave Canada. There may not be a better place in the 21st century, and I honestly believe that.
I wonder if you have a thought, and I hear this frequently, particularly from people who are from outside Canada, who are always wondering, where are the riots in your streets from people protesting against the kind of immigration you just described? And the fact is, yes, there are some people in the country, obviously, who are opposed to these high levels of immigration, but relatively few considering how potentially controversial this issue could be. Do you have a sense about why we don't seem to be rioting in the streets over this issue?
Well, let me first make a general statement about Western societies, which is that we give far too much attention to those minority voices that are the radicals, xenophobes, and populists and nationalists. Let's remember that their ideology and that their program and agenda for government always fails. So you can just watch them flame out as they have done in Italy, for example. The far right in Germany is much the same. It's happening in Eastern Europe now also, because ultimately the forces of supply and demand and demographics always prevail. Countries realize that they actually need young people, that they need to engage in this war for young talent. And Canada, again, is doing that proactively, as I said before, as a matter of economic strategy. How will you diversify your economy? How will you grow in the services sector? How will you take advantage of your natural resource endowment as well, your booming agriculture? All of the things that Canada wants to do in terms of its economic policy do require more people. Services economies are about people working for other people. Yes, they're also about digitization, which also requires importing more IT experts and professionals. So any way you slice it, you need more people. And I think that Canada has just had this very successful communications effort around this, really, of course, going back to the 1970s or even earlier as you embrace multiculturalism.
This is Beatrice Brusk, president of the Canadian Labour Congress, who had this to say about the minimum wage increase. She tweeted, "Ford canceled a planned minimum wage increase which cost low-wage Ontarians thousands of dollars, and during the pandemic, Ford opposed paid sick days. Workers simply cannot trust Conservatives to help them when they need it." Which takes me back to Smokey. Is this emblematic, in your judgment, of a bit of a split in the Labour movement right now, where you are prepared to say some nice things about Doug Ford when you think he's earned them, whereas the CLC president clearly appears not?
Well, the CLC president and the other two officers ran very proudly on the fact that they're NDP. And I actually had serious concerns about that election. It's late that all put the party ahead of workers by times, at least in my view, they do. And so I'm not surprised at what she said at all. But I don't actually, I agree with some of what she said, but it's incrementalism. You get Premier Ford to move on one or two things. You keep pushing them on other things. But my sense of the left is no matter what any party does, especially the Conservatives, it'll never be enough. It'll be too late. They'll find something to criticize. About a third of Labour is Liberal affiliated. About a third is NDP, and about a third are like myself, politically agnostic. So I do run into trouble with NDPers all the time, and some of them don't like me, and I don't much care. I got elected to represent Opposite members, and I just wish that it'd be my view that labor unions should remember who they got elected to represent, and that's the people that pay their dues, not a political party.
Martin, this government came into power back in 2018, June of 2018, promising to be populist, disruptive, small c conservative. And even though the party is called the Progressive Conservative Party, you sure didn't hear very much about the adjective, and you heard a lot about the noun. 3+ years later, where do you think they are right now?
Pivoting. He is a populist more than a progressive conservative. And, you asked a good question of Smokey earlier. Do you trust him? And the truth is that, like it or not, Doug Ford did what he said he was going to do 3 years ago. He said he would cancel the minimum wage, and he did it. And now he's saying, and he is legislating, that he's going to increase it. Should Labor love this government and should they trust this government are two different questions. I mean, the Ford government is hoping that Labor will back off, as you said earlier, and not beat up the PCs in the coming election. And they are trying to win the hearts and minds of Labor members, especially in the Southwest, where it's a two-way fight. The Liberals are not in contention, and so they go after blue-collar workers, Tories and New Democrats, both Windsor, Sarnia, that whole area, and so they are trying to win their hearts and minds. But Labor can and does break the heart of every government in power, whether it's teachers unions or other labor unions that went after the NDP. So this is politics. It's there's not unity in the labor movement, and there's certainly disunity on the political front. What I do think this tells us, in the poker sense, it's a tell, is that many of the labor leaders, Smokey, Jerry Dias, are giving up on the NDP. I'm not trying to make the NDP feel bad, but I think they've taken stock of the polling and the trend lines, and it looks like they don't think Andrew Horwath will be the next Premier of Ontario, whether you believe me or not. That's what the polls show too. And so just like they gave up on Kathleen Wynne in 2018, despite her promise of a wage increase, they thought she was dead in the water, and they were right. And so they lined up behind Andrew Horwath. And now they seem to be they're not lining up behind Doug Ford, but they're trying to use their pre-election leverage to lock in an increase. It's like locking in a low mortgage rate. They've locked it in. They gave him a photo op for a day, a one-day wonder. And can they trust him? Probably not. But this is now being legislated into law.
The new government, i.e. the Taliban, what we've observed is the crimes and the killings are happening in the shadows. So they're doing a good job of keeping it off the news, but we're receiving regular reports coming in through folks that we're talking to on the ground. We've been provided video footage of Taliban executing a police officer within the last 14 days. We've received reports of Taliban killing a midwife in a hospital when a baby was being born. We've seen national Olympian level athletes being captured and interrogated, beaten up and bruised. And unfortunately, we've seen the execution of interpreters that work for Canada. And they are literally capturing these folks in the middle of the night. They are tying their hands behind their back. They're shooting them in the face and then dropping them on the front doorstep of their families' homes, and then denying it that it was them in the first place. And so there is a real threat to the population who have ties to coalition forces, and it's getting worse day by day.
Are you, Corey, still in direct contact with any of those folks over there that were helpful to us?
So Amin Laura, the Canadian-led NGO that I was just speaking of, as of this morning, I received an update that Amin Laura is in contact with 2,761 families, which account for 13,261 people. So we are definitely in contact with a tremendous number of affected Afghans, and we are doing our absolute best to help advocate for this voiceless community and ask the government of Canada to expedite the approval process so we can try and get some more out of the country.
Let me just do a little fact checking here, because I have heard that you personally helped rescue one of your former interpreters who was so essential to your work over there, along with his wife and his 18-month-old daughter. Have I got that right?
Well, I was a link in the chain.
Oh, you're so typically Canadian modest, but that's good. We get that. Tell me, how did you do it?
So when this all started, I was thinking to myself, how can I help? What can I do? And I think the best place that I could support was by bringing awareness, by speaking to individuals like yourself. But it was really important at the time to try and tell the story of these trapped individuals. And I was able to be reintroduced to an interpreter that I worked with back in 2010, who is trapped in Lashkargah, Helmand province, which is in the southwest of Afghanistan. And what I was trying to do was gather some information about how bad was the threat, what did his life look like, so that I could pass that on to the Canadian population through interviews like this. It was during that process of speaking with him that the Taliban took over Lashkargah, and he sent a call for help to me by text message saying, if I don't get out of here within the next 24 hours, I'm afraid I'm going to be dead. And most likely my wife will be taken, and the Taliban will take her and wed her, and my daughter will be taken into, basically custody within the Taliban. And so I was the person who received the plea for help, and I leveraged the network of veterans and the connections that we had on the ground. And within a few days, we were actually able to coordinate with the Afghan National Army, which was still operating at the time, to get a helicopter to pick him up out of Helmand province and fly him to safety. We were able to help coordinate with his wife and daughter to get them driven to one of the safe houses. And we were also able to help get his younger brother out. Luckily enough, they were accepted as part of the immigration program, and they've since settled in Ontario.
That's just some of what we covered this week on The Agenda. For more, including the full conversations, you can visit our website, tvo.org, our YouTube channel at youtube.com/theagenda, or our Twitter feed, twitter.com/theagenda. And that's it for this Friday, November 12th, 2021. Ontario's biggest city just approved a new inclusionary zoning framework. Monday, we'll find out what impact it might have on development in the city. I'm Nam Kiwanuka. Thank you for watching TVO and for joining us online at tvo.org. Have a great weekend, and Steve, we'll see you again on Monday.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism. Ontario Hubs are made possible by the Barry and Laurie Green Family Charitable Trust and Goldie Feldman.